The Tom Woods Show, episode 565.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
All right, everybody, come on now. Here's an easy way to make 25 smackers. You ready? You head over to tomwoods.com/ebates, where you get cash rebates for almost all your online purchases, and you refer one friend, and you get $25. Come on now. tomwoods.com/ebates. You got to have like one friend, and you get $25. tomwoods.com/ebates right now. Welcome to another episode of the show. Today we are talking about Greece. We talked a little bit about Greece maybe about a year or so ago on the show. I'll link to that on today's show notes page, tomwoods.com/565. But I want to bring the story up to date. What's been happening? What are the lessons of the Greek situation? Are any of those lessons applicable to us in the United States or in Western Europe? These sorts of questions and more are what I'm going to want to ask Aris Trantidis, who is our guest today. He is a teaching fellow at the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. I'll be linking to his faculty page at tomwoods.com/565. And he is the author of a forthcoming book on the whole Greek crisis. So he is very much a person you'd want to talk to on this subject. Aris, welcome to the show.
Good evening from Greece.
Well, very glad to have a chance to speak to you. I devoted one episode of my show to Greece, and I just couldn't tell, frankly, how interested my audience is in international issues, but they are begging me for another episode on Greece, on what's been going on, in particular over the past year. But I think discussing the crisis, the nature of the crisis, lessons we can draw from it, would also be useful for us to talk about. Let me start off with a claim that we heard, at least in some sectors of the American media, and you tell me how much truth there is in it. Sometimes Americans were told that the root of, or at least one ingredient in the Greek crisis, was that the Greek welfare state had accustomed much of the Greek population to getting by with less labor for a smaller fraction of their lives than Americans are accustomed to doing, and now they're reaping the consequences of that. But on the other hand, I've seen statistics showing that, if anything, perhaps they're not as productive as people in some other countries. If anything, the Greeks work more than the Germans or others who are criticizing them. What's the truth of that?
Well, there is an element of truth. It's not particularly the welfare state, because the welfare state wasn't developed in Greece. People couldn't live on benefits back in the good old days. But it's about government in general, government spending and borrowing in general. You must know that Greece was a highly clientelistic state. What do I mean by clientelism is that the political powers tried to get votes by treating voters as clients, distributing benefits through the state, but very specific benefits, not like the kind of general entitlements you have in Sweden. But for instance, I will hire you, in the public sector, or I will give you a government contract as a businessman. This distributional system essentially was heavily dominated by the government, and it was what we call now crony capitalism, not the kind of capitalism in which the energy of entrepreneurs is directed into producing something that the world wants to consume, consumers, but surrounds the government and tries to extract rents from the government. And clientelism, meaning that this system spends a lot of money in accommodating the demands of the trade unions in the public sector to hire new people in state agencies. So the state expands, and the state is very costly. And one way to finance this system, this highly distributional system, is essentially to find an external source, because there are limits to taxation. You can't overtax the economy. Or if you try to overtax the economy, there's a lot of tax evasion happening. People will react. So Greece started to heavily borrow from abroad and to finance this highly distributional system. Now, these led to a surge in public debt in the 80s. And since the 80s, different governments tried to tackle this problem through patchy reforms, periods of austerity followed by the electoral cycle of spending a little bit more. And they also found the euro as an anchor through which they can have credit worthiness that will allow the governments to carry on borrowing at lower interest rates. Now, when the financial crisis happened in 2008 and the public deficit in Greece skyrocketed in 1 year, investors, already nervous with the global financial crisis, realized that Greece shouldn't borrow at cheap rates because it might not be able to pay back its debt, given the weaknesses of the economy. What were they? Not just high debt, but the fact that the model was so distributional. It was an economy that didn't produce enough for the world, for private consumers. It was an economy surrounding the state, the distributional state. So we have a production basis problem and a debt problem, and that led to the big burst of the crisis. That's why I say it's a crisis of government, not necessarily linked with the welfare state, but with the nature of government as an entity that is very likely to be hijacked by politicians who want to distribute benefits to their supporters and their crony businessmen.
Now, when you put it that way, of course, I think there'll be Americans who think, well, we see at least some of that in the United States, maybe not on the same scale as Greece. And it seems to be the nature of the state that it attracts this type of behavior, these type of policies, these type of people, this type of cronyism. So is it that Greece did Greece have a system that is fundamentally, qualitatively different from what we see in other European countries, or they just took it to an extreme that ultimately forced them to make changes?
I think that elements of government failure exist in any political system in which the state allocates resources, but Greece is the most extreme case because of its particular circumstances. Greece, for instance, was a democracy in the 70s when its industry faced the oil crisis. And the result was, instead of allowing companies to go bust and have what we call creative adjustment, when new investment will go into areas in which Greece can compete in the world and produce something that the world wants to buy, there was a lot of protectionism. People say you shouldn't allow workers to lose their jobs. We should subsidize these companies that were deficit running. And what happened there was the protectionism was the dominant ideology. And under the pressure of voters, the government decided to nationalize all that industry. Back in the 70s and in the 80s, not just the monopolies of energy, of telecommunications were under state control, but even toilet paper companies or textiles companies producing T-shirts were under state control. And this is because there was the idea that the state should protect employment and not allow the economy to balance itself through what we call creative destruction. If your company is not competitive, it should be allowed to go bust, because there will be new opportunities for investments somewhere else based on your comparative advantage or competitive advantage, if you want. So Greece was a much more extreme case because of this cycle of political incentives and the wrong ideas, the wrong dominant ideas about the role of the state in the economy. But I see that there's similar elements and similar ideologies in other countries as well. It's just that the Greece is a warning, essentially, for the rest of the world what not to do, essentially. I've always said that Greece is an education, not just in its ancient glory, but in its relative decline. And I have a book coming up in 6 months' time. It's called Clientelism and Economic Reform, The Case of Greece, in which I explain that this system of patronage of corruption is not a cultural trait that happens in a developing country. Greece is an advanced country, and it is a rational response of politicians, voters, and businessmen. It is rational, if you're a businessman, to want to be protected from competition if the alternative is to give a little bit of bribes, give a little bit of political support, and get a cheap loan from a state-owned bank and get protection and get privileges. It is rational, if you're a voter, to want to be employed in the public sector with all its safety. The system was not irrational. It was rational, but collectively it was a big failure. Collectively it was irrational. And those elements exist I can see them in every single political system. They are checked because of the power of ideas, because the ideas changed in the 70s, and because there are checks and balances in a society and different political forces, the media, or they are able in different countries to constrain this tendency of the governments to grow. But Greece, I think, is a useful lesson for every economy, including the American economy, about what not to do.
Are there some numbers that stand out to you that indicate the sheer scope of the Greek crisis, just how severe it is?
It is very severe. It's almost catastrophic. The country, remember, the country is an advanced economy. It has some relatively good institutions. It's not the perfect country in the world, but it has experienced a 30% drop of its GDP, of its economy. That's a warlike figure. It hasn't been seen in peacetime anywhere else in the world since the Great Depression of the 1930s in America. The unemployment, the official record of unemployment is around 22%. Youth unemployment has reached 60%. There is an exodus of workforce, emigration of workforce abroad, trying to find a job in England, in Germany, in Northern Europe. There was a humanitarian crisis. The situation is really bad. And that leads me to a second point I'd like to make, is that once the economy is messed up and the crisis bursts out, it is very difficult even for the most benevolent political elite, the most benevolent government, to find the right policy mix to fix this mess, to tackle this crisis. Because every single policy measure comes with unintended consequences. At this stage, you try to raise taxes to raise revenue, and all of a sudden, many businesses go bust. You try to implement cuts in spending, and all of a sudden, some people lose their revenue, and they're not able to pay their loans, which are nominated in in a hard currency, in prices that they can't be able to afford anymore. You try to fix one issue and you create another problem somewhere else, exactly because the economy is a complex system. The economy is not like a machine in which one spare part is wrong and then you have a spare part and you put it and the machine works again. It is rather like a human body in which, if the human body is really, really sick, you have to administer a medicine with a dose that can be fatal, or it can produce very serious side effects somewhere else. So we've seen, for instance, that the government raised taxes and many businesses go bust, or many businesses relocated to other countries to avoid paying these high taxes. We've seen, for instance, many people leaving the country, therefore no longer working in this country, contributing to its economy, no longer being part of the tax base. So you raise taxes and you get less tax revenue. You implement spending cuts, but your debt as a percentage of a shrinking GDP goes up. So you see that the lesson that we can draw from Greece is that economies should never be allowed to reach that messy situation, because economic reforms faces a fundamental knowledge problem. Just as the government doesn't know how to plan the economy in good times, it is very difficult for the experts, for the economy, for the Ministry of Finance and the economy to design a policy mix that is going to be effective. It's very difficult even for economists. They don't have the tools, econometric tools or economic mathematical modeling, to be able to calculate all the creative and adaptive responses of individuals in an economy.
I want to take some time now to see what's been going on since the last time we talked about this subject, which was probably early 2015. At least in the United States, there's a presidential election that's been taking over a lot of the news, the primary races and so on. And Greece is not the front page story anymore. And I bet some people think, well, I guess they worked that out somehow. So I'd like to talk about that. Let's pause just for a minute, though, for this message. When I decided to make my living online back in 2010 so that I wouldn't have to fly around the country every 3 days and constantly leave my family, sure, I had a lot of success on my own. But it didn't entirely come on my own. I looked around and found out who were the best people to learn from, who were the most successful people making a living online. And the most successful person I found was Chris Record. The guy is unbelievable. I've taken course after course with Chris Record, and thanks to him, for example, I have never run an unprofitable Facebook ad campaign. Never. I run 2 membership sites. Chris is an expert on how to establish a membership site, how to decide on a topic for a membership site. A membership site generates recurring income for you and helps give you stability if you decide to earn money online. He shows you how to create profitable online courses. And when Chris produces online courses, and as I say, I've taken his courses, he uses his own product, Smart Member, to create the courses. He's the best affiliate marketer I have ever seen. He's so good, in a matter of a few days, he can earn $40,000 in commissions on one product, or $70,000, or he just earned over $100,000 in commissions on just one product. Now, you're probably not going to be that good. Chris is that good because he has a whole development team that develops irresistible bonuses that practically compel people to order products through his link. But he is the best. And right now he's giving away a video series showing how he does what he does. He's giving away all the talks from his major conference last year. His conferences cost $497 to attend. He's giving the whole content away. So I would check this out. He's only going to have it up for about a week. So check it out through tomwoods.com/record. All right, so let's talk about what exactly has been done, and are things getting better or worse, or what are the politicians trying to do about it? What's been done? What happened in Greece in 2015 in response to the crisis?
Well, two very important events happened in Greece. In February 2015, left-wing party was elected, Syriza, to power, and formed a coalition with a right-wing party, promising to end austerity and to renegotiate the terms of the bailout agreement in a direction in which the adjustment of the economy, the fiscal adjustment of the economy, how much tax you should raise, how many cuts you should implement to reduce the deficit, will be much smoother and prolonged over a longer period of time. And also, they promised to renegotiate, to try to get into an agreement with Greece's creditors, the European Union, Eurozone countries, and the IMF, to restructure its debt, because they believe that this debt is not sustainable. There's no way Greece can repay its debt under the current terms. And they failed badly to achieve these goals, essentially because what they were asking, although they were backed by prominent economists, what they were asking is that the European taxpayers will essentially give more loans over a longer period of time, so that Greece will have the opportunity to adjust. And the European taxpayers and the European politicians were not willing to do that. All the negotiations were not fruitful, and in the summer of 2015, the Prime Minister Tsipras was forced to actually sign a third bailout agreement with the same type of terms and conditions than the previous ones that he had challenged as a leader of the opposition. Essentially, now he's trying to implement a program that he didn't believe, and I don't think he does believe in its whether it's efficient or not. And it's a very strange situation that shows the limits of politics. You may elect a government and believing that through elections, through a political agency, change can happen. But it's the economy and the broader institutional network puts a very strong constraint of what the national government can do, especially if you rely on other people's money. It shows the limits of politics, and it's again confirms the view that once you have a crisis as severe as the Greek crisis, the citizens will feel powerless. They will feel that they're going to pay a price that they shouldn't be paying, because apparently they weren't there when the previous governments took those decisions behind their back. I'd like to remind you that Greece was hiding debt from its own citizens and the European Union, essentially. And they feel that someone else has to pay for their society to get more time to adjust and grow again. On the other hand, there is another moral question: why the Slovakian taxpayer should pay more money so that Greece will get a smoother adjustment, when a pension in Slovakia is 100 or 200 euros, and the pension in Greece, the average pension is 1,000 euros. So the public debt creates a huge moral problem here. Those who are going to pay for a reckless borrowing are the taxpayers. And one might say, well, the Greeks are to blame for this, but the idea is that the Greek citizens do not have all the information about what's going on in the Ministry of Finance or what was going on in the Ministry of Finance in 2000s and in the 90s. They have only one vote every 4 years. They are not well informed. It's actually irrational not to be informed. And a lot of information was hidden from them and was hidden from experts in the European Commission, in the Eurostat, in the authorities that have the resources to be able to scrutinize a country's finance. How can we expect a butcher, a nurse, a doctor to be able to follow what's going on in behind closed doors? And on the other hand, the solution, the proposed solution to this crisis is to shift the burden on another pool of taxpayers in a European country, in Germany, in Slovakia, in France, in Italy, who are not responsible for the Greek crisis either. So this is a very difficult situation. It's a blame game, and it was dominated by economic nationalism, by moralism, which makes no sense. I think that if there's one single entity to be blamed, I think it's the reckless governments that were engaged in heavy borrowing and brought the country into that situation. And the lesson we have to draw is that once the economy gets into the mess, those who are going to pay for the crisis are the ones who are least responsible for the crisis. And the situation now in Greece is a little bit of the country has given up, essentially, has given up hope. It's very fatalistic. We have to undergo this process. I'm not sure whether the prime minister will still be as popular as he is today after a year of implementing this policy, but people are disillusioned with power and they're disillusioned with politics because they understand the limits of politics.
If you were in charge and you had, let's say, plenary power, and let's say we weren't concerned about separation of powers or anything like that, but you just knew what needed to be done, what would that be? What would your program be? Realizing that this is a extraordinary situation and very difficult, what would it take?
Well, as I said earlier, economic reforms, especially when they try to address a crisis of that scale, faces a fundamental cognitive problem. There are not easy solutions to the question of what should be done. So my question is, and I'm not a politician, but I am an expert in economic reforms, and I've studied economic reforms quite extensively, to be able to tell you that there is no optimal solution here. Of course, structural reforms help the economy, and like liberalizing markets, making workforce more flexible, but it takes a lot of time for those structural reforms to actually produce results, especially if your production base had already been distorted. And even if you lower wages, there's no industry in the first place to be competitive because most of the economic activity revolved around a consumption boom and domestic demand and government procurement. So you may say the easy recipe, structural reforms, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a rise of exports straight away. It's easy to say I'm going to attract investment, but with the specter of Brexit still in public discourse, who is going to invest in a country in euros when you may then end up having a devalued drachma later on? Stability is very important. The rule of law is also very important. Contracts, the justice system should be operational, better functioning. But all those reforms take time to materialize in benefit. The most difficult decision is how you're going to bring down the deficit and the debt. It's necessary to restructure the debt. Even the IMF acknowledges that the debt is unsustainable. There must be a way to restructure it, not necessarily writing it off, but extending its maturities over a prolonged time so it will be easier for Greece to pay back this debt over a longer period of time. But there are no magical solutions, essentially. Every single recipe has its side effects. I wouldn't raise taxes, but that's not in my hand to do. If you have the European Union telling you that you have to reach your fiscal targets in 1 year, the easiest thing to do is to raise taxes. Now, taxes have unintended consequences. They tend to undermine economic activity, further undermine consumption, and further undermine investment. I'm not a politician, but I am someone who studies political economy, so I'm not going to say how I would have run Greece. I'm going to say what kind of advice I give to the American audience. The government can mess up with the economy in different ways. In Greece, it was heavy borrowing, but in some other countries can be playing with money supply, can be expansionary monetary policies that do create asset bubbles. It's better to prevent this from happening, because once a bubble is burst, any form of policy response is likely to have serious side effects, and it may trigger a vicious circle in which the country is trapped for many, many years.
I have to ask you, we deal with an economist over here named Paul Krugman. You're probably familiar with him, Nobel Prize winner. He writes for the New York Times. And I have a separate podcast, which, unlike this one, runs only once a week, called Contra Krugman. And every week we refute his New York Times column. Well, Krugman makes fun of people in the United States who think there might be lessons for the United States in the Greek crisis. Because he says every time, and so every time anybody is concerned about the government budget or the debt or the deficit, Krugman will pipe up and say, "It's Greece, I tell you, Greece." So he's contemptuous of his intellectual opponents. But should he be? Should he be laughing? Are there lessons that Americans should be drawing?
Well, I have great respect for Krugman and all the prominent economists, but of course you may have the right to disagree and say that there are some weaknesses in their arguments. I'm not going to take issue with Krugman. I'm going to take issue with the belief that economics has the right tools to predict the right path to recovery, and they don't. Whether you are in MIT or whether you're in Chicago, you have certain methods. You have statistics and economic modeling, trying to capture what has happened and on that basis, trying to make some predictions for the future. And these tools are flawed because it's a very complex system. And there are many unintended events that may happen from the adaptive, creative response of economic actors in a given country. I told you the example of taxation and its side effects, asset bubbles being created by monetary expansions, artificially low interest rates, may give the wrong signals to individuals to do all sorts of things that, through network effects, will create a new bubble, essentially. And once the bubble bursts, again, you have this network effects, the herd instincts, and a domino of reactions that lead to a fiscal crisis. It's very hard to predict with accuracy and to say that this is the right path and this is the wrong path, because the tools of economics are flawed. Not just economics, but in general in social science. We should not have this hubris of saying this is what should be done. We do not have the tools to predict everything. We don't have the tools to calculate how a system is going to work. Things are not linear. Things are very unpredictable. Therefore, my critique is that we can draw different lessons from Greece, but you should be careful about predicting or dictating what should be done, because we do not have the right methodologies, and we're never going to get the right methodologies to be able to capture the complexity of economic and, in general, human phenomena. Can you tell us a brief word about the book that you have forthcoming later this year, 2016? Yeah, the book is going to be called Clientelism and Economic Policy, The Case of Greece. And the term clientelism describes a relationship between politicians and their voters or other social actors or social groups, which is based on the exchange of benefits. I'll give you a special benefit because I run the economy. I can give you a license to operate your business, or I can give you a job, I can give you a promotion in return for your political loyalty and support. And what the book says, drawing on the case of Greece, is that clientelism is the default position of politics. It is rational for politicians and voters to engage in this practice, essentially because the benefits they get are very tangible and individual-based. However, this system of exchange on the macro level is very costly, essentially, because it diverts investment and energy from productive activities into rent-seeking and the pursuit of special benefits. And in the case of Greece, that led to a debt crisis because the way to finance the system was through borrowing, predominantly external borrowing. And of course, there were community funding as well that helped sustain this distributional system. But it can take any other form. Governments can use other tools to sustain a distributional system. But in the end, it leads to a permanent crisis that governments have to manage how they're going to keep running the system despite the crisis. In Greece, they tried to implement some reforms. They tried to find to draw creditworthiness by joining the euro. But an exogenous shock in 2008 exposed the weaknesses of this economy and led to the Greek crisis. However, I'm using game theory, so I'm using a rational argument to show that what happened in Greece is not country-specific. It's not a cultural phenomenon in the Mediterranean or in Latin America, but it's actually, as I said, the default position of politics, and different countries, different institutional environments must develop their own formal or informal checks and balances to keep this tendency at bay before it's too late.
Well, I appreciate this important analysis. I'm going to link to, let's see, anything you send me that you think our audience should read, anything that you do, I'm going to link to your faculty page. This will all be at, let's see what episode number this is. This is tomwoods.com/565, because this is episode 565, so that will be the show notes page for today. Well, Aris, I appreciate your time today, and when your book comes out, maybe we'll talk to you again.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Much appreciated.
All right. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about the non-aggression principle. We've never devoted an entire episode to that subject, and believe it or not, even in libertarian circles, the non-aggression principle has become weirdly controversial. So we're going to go through it step by step and give what I think is the correct way of thinking about it and rehabilitate the non-aggression principle. So I hope you'll join me for that. Also, in case you never got around to it, my most recent book is called Real Dissent, with the subject line, A Libertarian Sets Fire to the Index Card of Allowable Opinion. And if you enjoy this show, I think you will find that a very enjoyable read. It covers all kinds of topics, and it has a whole section of my replies to various critics of our position, whether it's people on Slate or Salon or some other thought control site like that. And these are the sorts of articles of mine that people seem to enjoy the most, and there's a section of this book in which I collect them all for your reading enjoyment. So I hope you'll check that out. The Kindle version of the book, it's a big book, and the Kindle version is only $3.99. It's barely 4 smackers. I mean, come on now, 4 smackers, come on. Come on, check that baby out over at realdissent.com, and you can get the audiobook version of the book with me reading it for free through tomwoodsaudio.com. That's it for today. See you tomorrow when we talk about the non-aggression principle.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.